Welcome, Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Bronwyn, and thank you all for coming here this morning. And thank you to Chatham House for hosting and for your resolute commitment to dialogue on this issue, an issue that so many people recoil from out of despair, a despair that in the last 3 weeks has arguably reached new depths. Indeed, anyone who has followed this closely and seen images that can never be unseen, tiny bodies wrapped in bundles in Israel and Gaza, mothers and fathers shattered by the ultimate grief, the innocent dead, Israeli, Palestinian, Muslim, Jew. It's a tragedy where the facts on the ground are changing by the minute, but where the consequences will last for decades and the trauma might never fade. A crisis where the search for solutions is shrouded not just by the fog of war, but by an ever-darkening cloud of misinformation. But nonetheless, we must do what we can, and we must explain what we do. Democratic accountability matters, particularly in light of the rising temperature on British streets. Our efforts must respond to the two immediate tragedies. To the 7th of October, the biggest slaughter of Jews, and that is why they were killed, do not doubt that, since the Holocaust. Men, women, children, babies, murdered, mutilated, and tortured by the terrorists of Hamas. Over 200 hostages, including British citizens, taken back into Gaza. Make no mistake, this is terrorism on a scale and brutality that few countries have ever experienced, certainly not this one. And that is an immutable fact that must drive our response to these events. As must the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, which again plays out on a previously unimaginable scale. Thousands of innocent Palestinians dead, displaced, desperate for food and water, reduced to drinking contaminated filth, hiding out in hospitals for shelter, whilst in those same buildings, babies lie in incubators that could turn off at any moment. At every stage during this crisis, my approach has been driven by the need to respond to both these tragedies, to stand by the right to self-defense of any nation which suffers terrorism on this scale, alongside the basic human rights of innocent Palestinians caught once again in the crossfire. To focus at every stage on the practical steps that might make a material difference on the ground. In the short term, on the humanitarian conditions in Gaza and the efforts by Israel to rescue her hostages. But in the future, also to the hope that I know still burns brightly for those who want peace. The two-state solution, an Israel where every citizen enjoys the security they need, and a viable Palestinian state, where the Palestinian people and their children enjoy the freedoms and opportunities that we all take for granted. And that is why, while I understand calls for a ceasefire at this stage, I do not believe that it is the correct position now, for two reasons. One, because a ceasefire always freezes any conflict in the state where it currently lies. And as we speak, that would leave Hamas with the infrastructure and the capability to carry out the sort of attack we saw on October the 7th. Attacks that are still ongoing, hostages who should be released still held. Hamas would be emboldened and start preparing for future violence immediately. And it is this context which explains my second reason, which is that our current calls for pauses in the fighting for clear and specific humanitarian purposes, and which must start immediately, is right in practice as well as principle. In fact, it is at this moment the only credible approach that has any chance of achieving what we all want to see in Gaza: the urgent alleviation of Palestinian suffering, aid distributed quickly, space to get hostages out. That is why is also the position shared by our major allies in the US and the EU. And I urge all parties to heed its call. Over time, the facts on the ground will inevitably change in relation to both hostages being rescued and Hamas's capability to carry out attacks like we saw on October the 7th. And we must move to cessation of fighting as quickly as possible. Because the reality is that neither the long-term security of Israel nor long-term justice for Palestine can be delivered by bombs and bullets. Open-ended military action, action without a clear and desired political outcome, is ultimately futile. This needs to begin now, because a political agreement, however unlikely that seems today, however painful the first steps are to take, is the only way to resolve this conflict once and for all. That is why our position and our counsel has always been that Israel must submit to the rules of international law. The right to self-defense is fundamental, but it's not a blank check. The supply of basic utilities like water, medicines, electricity, and yes, fuel to civilians in Gaza cannot be blocked by Israel. Every life matters, so every step must be taken to protect civilians from bombardment. Palestinians should not be forced to leave their homes en masse. But where they have no choice but to flee within Gaza, we need crystal clear guarantees that they will be able to return quickly. You cannot overstate the importance of this last point. In conflicts like this, the most painful blows are those that land on the bruises of history. And for Palestinians, the threat of displacement sends a shiver down the spine. It must be disavowed urgently, clearly, and by all. Because while it may feel like a truism, so often the trauma of the present leads directly to the tragedy of the future. Hamas know this. They knew Israel would have to respond. Their aim on October the 7th was not just to kill Jews. It was to bring death upon their fellow Muslims in Gaza. A plan written in blood to isolate Israel from the West, destroy its improving relations with other Arab nations, and ultimately provoke wider regional conflicts across the Middle East. That threat remains real. And I echo President Biden's sage advice to Israel to understand in its own interests why a whirlwind of understandable emotion and rage must not blind it to the fact that it is Hamas it must target. Hamas that is the enemy. Hamas brutality that must be prevented, and not the Palestinian people who must be protected. So I say again, We have to get many more aid trucks across the Rafah crossing. We have to get food, water, electricity, medicine, and fuel into Gaza. We have to preserve innocent lives. Hospitals must be protected and cannot become targets. Across the West, we've been calling for this for weeks, but it hasn't happened. The siege conditions haven't lifted. That's unacceptable, and it cannot continue. The risk of regional escalation is real, and it must be prevented. This is why millions of people across our country are rightly concerned. Concerned as well about the impact this is having on communities here in Britain. There are some who want us divided, but our approach to multiculturalism is envied around the globe. Jews, Christians, and Muslims live side by side, and this is so ordinary, it's barely remarked upon. Interfaith marriages are common. People celebrate each other's traditions and festivals as naturally as they do their own. The freedom of religious expression is uncontroversial. We don't stop often enough to reflect on how unusual this is, how Britain's modern diverse democracy is an existential challenge to people all around the world who say, this cannot be done. Something we've worked hard for through the generations, and that at moments like this, we have a responsibility to fight for. We cannot have a Britain where Jewish businesses are attacked, Jewish schools marked with red paint, Jewish families hiding who they are. We cannot have a Britain where Muslim women feel scared to take public transport, mosques are attacked, Palestinian restaurants receive death threats. No, this isn't our Britain. And in the Labour Party, we will have to reach out to communities under pressure and show them the respect and empathy they deserve as a fundamental British right. But ultimately, the gravest ramifications of failure will, of course, be felt in the Middle East itself. For too long, the international community has put the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into the too difficult box. There's no recent equivalent of anything like the concerted push for peace we saw in the 1990s and the early 2000s. No, what has happened is we have continually paid lip service to a two-state solution because it's easier, convenient perhaps, to look away from Gaza, knowing it is controlled by those who want to kill Jews and wipe Israel off the map. To look away from Israel, knowing people live without the security which they deserve. To look away from the West Bank, knowing more settlements are being built against international law. Now, I don't say any of this to start a new round of arguments or hand-wringing. Instead, this must be a time for a new resolve, a renewed push from all parties to find a way to peace. It will mean engaging with our Arab partners, working urgently on viable plans for a Palestine free from the terrorism of Hamas. It will mean engaging with Israel, seeking to address its security concerns in the future, but showing clearly that the settlement building is unacceptable, unlawful, and has to stop. The Palestinian people need to know there is a genuine will and determination from Israel, from Arab states, from the West, to finally address their plight in deeds as well as words. Because the Palestinian claim to statehood is not in the gift of a neighbour. It is inalienable right of the Palestinian people and the clear logic of any call for a two-state solution. So my Labour Party will fight for that cause. We will work with international partners towards the recognition of a Palestinian state as part of a negotiated, just and lasting peace. Because even in the darkest days, in fact, especially in the darkest days, we have to keep alive the light of peace. Fight, despite the horror of the present, for the fragile hope of the future, focusing always on the difference we can make. This is an old conflict, but it is not, and never has been, an issue that will be solved by the black and white simplicity of unbending conviction. Rather, the colour of peace, always in conflict resolution, is grey. And in the coming days and months, we must do everything we can to fight for it. Thank you very much.
Keir Starmer there, speaking at the Chatham House think tank, and I think he's now going to take some questions from the audience.
Keir Starmer, thank you very much indeed for that. Let me just kick off by asking a couple of questions on this vision you've set out. And the first question is what you think Britain can do itself, what influence it still has. You've made a very direct call there for international progress towards a two-state solution, reviving what some people, as I said before, think has long gone. What is it that Britain can do, and what, if you were in number 10 at the moment, would you do?
Well, thank you for that question. I think we've got to look at the short term, the here and now, and that is undoubtedly the urgent question of humanitarian aid. You've only got to see the images on our screens of innocent civilians suffering, dying, hospitals unable to cope, to know that we have to urgently address that issue. And we have to pull together, we have to make that case for humanitarian pauses to allow that aid to get in. It is urgent, it was urgent last week and the week before. This humanitarian crisis has been going on for a very, very long time. So that's the immediate, and to allow and argue for the release of the hostages. They should not have been taken, they should not be held, and Hamas should release them immediately. And so they're the two immediate things that we have to address. But I think Britain also has to address the longer term, because, and I know some people will say, look, in the current context, it's impossible to even think about a two-state solution. I don't accept that. I think that because of the desperation of the situation we're in, we have to start the discussion about a two-state solution. I think that looking away in the last 10, arguably 20 years, has been a dereliction of responsibility, and we have to take up that responsibility, and we have to take it up now. So that's what I would be concentrating on if we were in government now.
And by that you mean taking that to Israel, making those points to Israel and perhaps to Qatar, which is negotiating with Hamas?
Yes, to all, I mean, to allies, to partners across the Middle East, to the US, this has to be a concerted effort. I think too many people have looked away and simply said it's too difficult, knowing what's been going on in Gaza, what's been going on in the West Bank. They've looked away. We cannot justify that any longer.
Thank you for that. Let me ask one more. You're a lawyer of legal background. I'm not intending that to be a controversial statement. And from what you've described of Israel's actions at the moment in its justified pursuit of Hamas, do you think it's acting within international law?
It has to act in accordance with international law. This is not an optional extra and nice to have. It has to be in accordance with international law. And that is a point that we have repeatedly pressed on Israel, and other countries have pressed on Israel. It has to act in accordance with the law. As to whether each and every act is in accordance with the law, well, that will have to be adjudicated in due course. I think it's unwise for politicians to stand on stages like this or to sit in television studios and pronounce day by day which acts may or may not be in accordance with international law. I think it's not the role of politicians. I don't think it's wise to do it. I come with the benefit of a lawyer of having litigated about issues like this in the past, and in my experience, it often takes weeks or months to assimilate the evidence and to then work out whether there may or may not have been a breach of international law. So I think the call for politicians to look at half a picture on the screen without the full information and form an instant judgment as to whether it's this side of the line or the other side of the line is extremely unwise, and I'm not going to get involved in that kind of exercise. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I could ask you a follow-up, but that would take us into the question of international law itself and why Israel has to do that. Instead, I'm going to release you to ask and pick your own questions from...
to the media.
Release you to the media, and I will come up again at the end.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn, and I'll go straight to the media. I've got a list, I think, of all those that want to ask a question, and I'll try and get through just as many as I possibly can. I think first we've got Vicky Young at the BBC.
Thank you very much. In about a year's time, you are hoping to be Prime Minister. If that happens, will you allow your own ministers to undermine your authority and publicly disagree with you on the most important issues of the day?
Look, collective responsibility is really important. There's no doubt about that, as is unity. And what is really important in answering this question and addressing this point is to understand what is driving people at the moment. I think it's impossible for anyone to see the suffering that we're seeing in Gaza and not feel compelled to try to do something about it. And that's why I said in my short speech that I understand why people are asking for a ceasefire. But equally, I do not think that a ceasefire now is the right way forward for the reasons I set out. So there is unity here. I'm obviously engaging with my front benchers, but there is unity, and what we want to see, which is the alleviation of the awful situation in Gaza. It is for me to address collective responsibility. I recognise that that is my duty. It matters, and I take that duty extremely seriously. But I do it in the context of understanding what is driving people in the call for a ceasefire, which is, in my judgment, not the call that we should be making as things stand for the reasons I set out. Thank you, Vicky. Anushka, ITV.
Keir Starmer, the reason that dozens of Labour MPs are urging you to call for a ceasefire is because over 3,000 children are dead. Because you haven't done that today, we know that shadow ministers are considering resigning. The mayors of London and Manchester disagree with you. The leader Labour in Scotland says that you have hurt Muslim communities. How on earth are you going to bring your party back from this level of division?
Well, we've all seen those images of children dead, and there's no unseeing those images. And I think it's really important to understand that. For the reasons I set out, notwithstanding that I do understand why some are calling for a ceasefire, I do not think that that is the right call now, because it does freeze the situation as it currently is. And if we freeze the situation as it currently is, that means that Hamas is left with the capability to carry on with the sort of attacks it carried out on the 7th of October and is continuing to carry out. It is still attacking. And of course, it is holding 200 plus hostages. You cannot freeze that situation without effectively denying a sovereign state its self-defense. But allied to that, and to alleviate the thing that is driving others to argue for a ceasefire, the humanitarian pauses to allow aid in are the practical, workable, viable solution that could be implemented realistically in the near future to allow that to happen. So for both of those reasons, my strong argument is that a ceasefire is not right now because it freezes the situation. Humanitarian pauses allow for an alleviation of the awful situation on the ground. Thank you, Anushka. I've got Paul from Channel 4.
Thank you, Keir. Look, we've seen untold death and destruction in Gaza. Thousands of children lost their lives. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees has lost 63 of their staff members since October 7th. That's 63 UN workers dead since October 7th. Are you saying that Israel's actions in Gaza at the moment are justifiable? And if so, where do you draw the line, Keir Starmer?
Well, firstly, in relation to your description of the aid workers and NGOs, Lisa and Andy and I met some of the NGOs just days ago, and they described to us the conditions in which they are trying to work. They described to us staff members who had lost members of their family, one staff member searching through the rubble in Gaza to try to find his 13-year-old niece who was dead, and I have a 12-year-old girl, and you can't be unmoved by those stories. The question is not how awful is that, because it is truly awful. The question is, what is the most practical way to do something about it? And that's why I said in my speech I've been driven by the response to the October the 7th tragedy and to the humanitarian tragedy, but also bearing in mind what is practical that will make a material difference on the ground. And I think it's humanitarian pauses, particularly with other countries, allied countries, the US, etc., making that similar call. They are the practical way to achieve that. So I'm not quarrelling with the need to address that. I am saying what is the best way, the right way to address that in the circumstances as they are. And my answer to that is humanitarian pauses for the specific purpose of aid and provision into Gaza, but not a ceasefire that actually leaves Hamas in a position to continue what it is doing now, continue attacking, to continue holding hostages, and to have the capability of doing what it did on October the 7th again. That cannot be now, at this point, the right answer to the awful suffering that we see in Gaza. Thank you very much, Paul. Tamara, Sky.
Tamara Cohen from Sky News. So, Keir, would you accept that this issue is tearing your party apart? You have made clear you don't support a ceasefire. If senior figures in your party continue to call for one, will they face any consequences? And can I also ask, you've backed the government's plan for humanitarian pauses. What, if anything, do you think the government are getting wrong in their response to this crisis?
Tamara, on tearing the party apart, I think it's very important to recognise the unity in the Labour Party on the key issues. There's unity in trying to bring about an alleviation of the awful situation in Gaza. So nobody in the Labour Party is making any other case than that we have got to alleviate the suffering. We have got to speak out for Israel's right to self-defense, and we've got to alleviate the suffering. So there's complete unity on that. There is also unity not just on the short term, but what is the long-term answer to this, and that is the two-state solution. We had a big affirmation of our policy, a united affirmation of our policy in July of this year, that the two-state solution is the only way forward. So there is, we're not tearing the party apart, there's unity on that. There are differences of view on how you achieve that, and that's why I say I understand why people argue for a ceasefire, but I do not think that is the right argument at this time. But we need to focus on where that unity is. It is my responsibility to ensure collective responsibility. I accept that. And we do need collective responsibility, and I take that duty extremely seriously. In relation to the government, look, the government is sharing intelligence with us on a regular basis, for which we are grateful. And at the moment, we are making the same calls to Israel, to others in the region, and with our allies. We are all talking to the Americans, to Middle East leaders, to Israel, as you would expect. And at this stage, when, bearing in mind, over 200 people are being held hostage, I don't think for me trying to find points of difference with the government is what the families of those hostages most want to hear. We met some of them just 2 weeks ago with harrowing stories of what has happened and their fears, understandable. And they urged on us that the United Kingdom stand as united and strong as it can in support of their right to have their loved ones back. And I heed what they say in answering your question. Thank you. Lee, Jewish News.
Good morning, Keir.
So Keir Starmer, the Labour Party leader, setting out his position on the Israel-Gaza war. This is amid growing tensions within the party over the conflict and the party's stance over it. He did reiterate his support for a humanitarian pause, but again also emphasised he did not think that the time was right for a ceasefire, which he said would leave Hamas in its efforts to continue its attacks on Israel. Let's get some analysis on what he had to say with our political correspondent Ian Watson, who is in Westminster. Hi Ian, welcome to you. So what do you think about the words he said? Will it bring unity back to the party?
I think it was interesting that he stressed there was unity in the party. You'd expect him to do that, I guess, to accentuate the positive amidst the dissent, given his current position. So he said there was unity, for example, in alleviating the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Unity, too, on the long-term future for the region. Labour's support for a two-state solution, a Palestinian state and Israel living side by side in security. But it was pretty clear from his answers to some of those questions after the speech that he isn't minded to take any action against those on his front bench, those who have official roles in the Labour Party, speaking on the Labour Party's behalf, who have effectively broken ranks with him over this question of a ceasefire. Those who've called for a ceasefire rather than his position for a shorter term humanitarian pause to get more aid into Gaza. He said he was going to continue to engage with them. So I think he is aware of the potential dangers of acting against those in his own party who are perhaps representing constituencies with large numbers of people from Muslim communities, for example, or those who simply have very deeply held views on this issue. So it's a bit of a softly approach. I think also he had been criticised by the Scottish Labour leader of being hurtful towards some people in the Muslim community, with his staunch support of Israel's right to self-defence initially. And again, I think there was a bit of a corrective in this speech where he was saying, for example, not talking about Gaza specifically, but talking about the West Bank and suggesting that settlements there by some Israelis were not only unlawful but were unacceptable and had to stop. And he also said that while Israel had the right to self-defence, it didn't have a blank check. And again, he emphasised it had to act within international law. So I think he was trying to be very, very even-handed indeed. The question now, though, is whether that will be enough to allay some of the dissent in his own ranks, whether it will be enough to stop those who might have been considering resigning from their official positions to do so, because at its core, despite the language and despite the tone, he is still sticking to the line that his position is that a ceasefire would embolden Hamas, and a humanitarian pause, as he calls it, would be very much more in line with the international community, with the EU and the US position. So he hasn't really in any way deviated from that, but I think his tone has been sympathetic, saying he understands those who are watching the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, who call for a ceasefire, but he simply doesn't think it's the right position at the moment.
OK, Ian in Westminster, thank you.